that misinformation has always been with us. But
they say that privacy is dead and social media holds a smoking gun.
Not here to make any compromises in journalism.
You do read the newspapers, you're misinformed. And so we're in that particular world where, nothing is black and white anymore.
I think some of us in the media world like to sensationalize things. And I think it's much better for us to have a cool head on our bodies.
Someone famously said, media is the art of arresting the human intelligence long enough to make money from it. Hello, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of In Conversation with Roy, a forum where we probe and dig deep into the learnings and the experiences of global leaders who truly matter in every letter. I'm absolutely honored to have Achilles Tsaltas, president of the Democracy and Culture Forum UK, as a part of our guest here. Now, Achilles has been a part of New York Times as the vice president, where he was mandated to curate and lead the Democracy and Culture Foundation that he has been able to establish into a roaring success, so much so that probably they'll celebrate 10 years next year as we speak. Achilles is a Greek by descent, migrated to Australia, raised in Australia, and of course, he's been a part of top-notch media corporations in the world, from News Corporation Australia to International Herald Tribune to New York Times, spanning continents, spanning demographic divide and cultural synchronicities as well. So Achilles, a very warm welcome to the show. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Roy, and very nice to be on your show.
Pleasure is all ours, Achilles. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. Now, I'll just have to probably start with one quote, really. If you have to quote Mark Twain, he said, if you don't read the newspapers, you are not informed. But if you do read the newspapers, you are misinformed. And so we're in that particular world where, nothing is black and white anymore. And coming back to your journey, though, from the seat of civilization in Greece to the land of kangaroos, you obviously, from being part of a migrant family, you had to traverse through meandering ways of complexities, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, to a checkered career that you are a part of now. So how has been your journey so far? What's been the story of your life, Achilles?
Look, let me say first, referring to your quote from Mark Twain, he was here with us,
right,
observing what's going on with media now and misinformation. Right. I think he'd be very perplexed as to why misinformation has taken such a trajectory, because, I mean, the reality is that misinformation has always been with us, but definitely in this age of a technological revolution that we're living in, it's much more pronounced. And I'm happy that I'm not him and that I am here, because I believe we live in one of the most exciting times in history, where we're transitioning from the way we used to do things into something that we don't know exactly what it's going to be like. And I mean, that's what transitions are all about. So, and even my own personal story of, born of Greek migrants in Australia and living between two countries, and in my adult life, living in different cities around the world, it's been a journey of transition, a constant transition, an adaptation to different cultures, different ways of thinking. There's a very different way that Chinese think, the time that I worked in Hong Kong, very different way that people in the Middle East think, the time I've worked a little bit in Dubai. You mentioned that I'm Greek. I think there's a lot of similarities between the cultures of Middle East and Greece, but the Western cultures of Europe and the States are remarkably different. And I've had the privilege to live there as well. So yes, I mean, if I am to say something about my personal story, it's one of transition, and I think that's what made it exciting.
Wonderful, wonderful. And so probably on that context, really, when when there's a complete lack of, if I may say, transparency to a large extent, credible news is more of a rarity. So how do we really, in terms of a content strategy, are we able to balance the credible news being monetized vis-a-vis the breaking news concept that is there, propagated mostly by social media and its forms?
Look, I mean, the biggest time of my working life I've spent with the New York Times Company, and the philosophy there has always been invest in quality, don't compromise on the journalistic infrastructure of the organization, and everything is there to serve journalism, and it's not we're not really here to monetize the operation out of journalism. We're not here to make any compromises in journalism, but you kind of move along with the times, and you create other products, and you monetize a media organization through the digital pathway or through advertising without ever compromising your journalistic integrity.
Correct. In an age and time, when data sanctity and data privacy rather is a huge buzzword, really, they say that privacy is dead and social media holds a smoking gun. So how are we able to really look at compliance and privacy as being allies in terms of moving news agencies forward?
I think coming from the media world, privacy is dead and social media is a smoking gun. I think some of us in the media world like to sensationalize things, and I think it's much better for us to have a cool head on our bodies and not to avoid sensationalizing things. News is very important. Media is a sector that is in the middle of this technological revolution. And what is a revolution? A revolution is all about innovation. It's about finding new ways to solve old problems, really. And humanity has an innate tendency to constantly innovate, and we should not, and social media is a form of innovation. But, as with everything in life, you need to balance things. And on the other side of innovation, we need to have regulation. Because if you have too much innovation without regulation, it gets out of hand. In the same way that if you have too much regulation without innovation, you just stagnate and you don't progress. So I think we should be more open. Things that, say, the European Union has done with GDPR, for example. We should be more open in regulating. We should not put all the blame on the big tech companies, as it's the easy target. There's a responsibility of the public sector to help the private sector to regulate, as much as there is a responsibility for the private sector, the tech companies, to become more responsible, to show more focus on CSR and ESG strategies, and this notion of inclusive capitalism that the private sector is starting to talk about.
Very true, and well articulated as well. I think in terms of media as well, in terms of platform, the genesis of media from print down to the digital side, let's say conferences coming into play, broadcast coming into on its own. The whilst you have the duopoly of your Googles and the Facebooks of the world, and the agencies and the publishers and the clients thereof are trying to find their own feed. There is a school of thought, which says there is a platform, there is a platform vis-a-vis the publishers debate as to whether there will be a cartel of sorts, rather, of publishers coming together and being able to circumvent a way where they are able to find their own niche. So your thoughts on that?
Publishers coming together, what, in the digital world, you're saying?
In the digital world, coming together, more of an alliance, more of a, let's say, qualified cartel, so to speak, and being able to circumvent the way in which media is operated.
Yes, if you mean the publishers forming certain associations where they collaborate instead of just looking at the competitive side of things, absolutely. We do need much more collaboration at a time when our industry, the media industry, is threatened by this revolution. So I'm all for coming together and finding ways of, again, what I said at the very beginning, of not compromising our editorial ethos and the journalistic integrity that we need to have. And, some of us, go for the quick buck instead of the long-term game, which is maintaining our journalistic credibility. In the sense, in a situation where you have more of these associations, then you're able to monitor and even police the behavior of the members of those associations.
True. Yeah, probably it's at a very nascent stage, so to speak. I'm not too sure in what form or what kind of vigor it will probably come in, but I believe that there are remnants of the thought, though. I mean, it's quite rampant as we speak, as I speak with a lot of CEOs and CEOs rather. So they echo the sentiment that probably, it's a time that we are able to face the duopolistic mindset, moving away from there, being able to collaborate in a much larger form. So coming back to media, you have traversed different forms in terms of platforms. Rather, you have handled advertising, you moved into circulation, moved on to conferences, and redefined conferences as we speak in the form that you have now. Having said that, a lot of changes have happened. Obviously, print has declined. Print has become very, very niche. I believe Financial Times was one particular media brand that really showed the way that there comes a time when you have to look at monetizing print as a niche platform rather than being able to depend on large circulation numbers. At the same time, there is a focus, or there's, let's say, a trend rather, moving away from advertising revenues to the consumer revenue side. A lot of focus back on the content strategy thereof. Are we niche? Are we compelling? And so on and so forth, where people are willing to pay the extra buck to probably view our content. So since you have been a part of that journey, really, where print was really at the helm, to probably a journey now where you find, obviously because of COVID and so on and so forth, digital disruption has become more of a reality, and more of our audience segments are moving on to, which is online, rather than, let's say, picking up a 16-page broadsheet, so to speak. So your thoughts, and probably some bit of, in hindsight rather, is this something that has that will find its own feet going forward?
Look, undoubtedly, there is a need for all media to change their business model. The advertising market has fragmented. The advertising revenues are no longer enough to sustain a media organization. So the business model needs to shift to a model where you put more focus, more emphasis on the end user, which is the consumer, because the advertiser is not the end user. They also want to use the platform to communicate, whereas the end user wants to use the platform to get information. And in all this change that you're describing here, in all this disruption and all this going, that print is no longer as powerful and it's all digital, the one constant in all that is information. So that's why you have to put the focus on the journalists that produce the information, and on the other hand, the consumer, the reader that wants that information. And it is what the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal did in a very niche way, because they managed to find a niche in the financial sector who needed the information. So they had to pay to get that information, and slowly niche publication, if we can call them niche publications like that, managed to kind of get another source of revenue. And then on the other hand, you have the New York Times, which is not really a niche publication, it's a general interest publication. But they managed to, it was a very long and successful strategy of charging for content on the net. And now, New York Times is sitting on something around 8 million digital subscribers. And the consumer revenue, it's much more important than the advertising revenue. Or not much more important, it's much bigger.
Much bigger.
And that's helping the organization to sustain its financial health and to sustain its mission, which is to enhance society through the delivery of quality information. Now, not everyone is like the New York Times that has a big audience to tap into. But all our audiences in our respective countries that we live in are big enough. You can create different products that are of interest to different constituencies, and there is a way to shift your model away from advertising revenue-led to consumer revenue-led.
Correct, but that's probably a journey which is easier said than done, because at the heart of it is your content, the quality of your content, and your understanding of how your audience sets are probably moving or transitioning. And we here in this part of the region, we tried to experiment that way. Few players did go that way, and we tried to look at paywalls and paid subscriptions, so on. But when we were not ready with the kind of content that will probably be perceived well, and then obviously it didn't go too well though. So probably I think it's a journey really. I think there's a lot of learnings to be had from how the West has really evolved from being able to become a provider of credible and niche and exotic news to what the people would really want to read and pay for, rather than being really looking at a big bang approach. Having said that, I think a lot depends, Achilles, in terms of the so-called tech platform that we have. So what are your thoughts in terms of most of the publishing companies moving in from, let's say, the DMPs to the CDPs of the world?
From the what? Sorry, I didn't.
From the DMP, the data management platform, to the customer platform.
Data managed platform to
the customer data platform, where things are more personalized,
Look, I think you need to get closer to the customer as well. You need to train the customer on how to use information, how to use data, and I think that's what the New York Times did very well in terms of communicating and marketing to their customers. Because you say that in your part of the world people are not ready. I don't think people were ready in the United States to pay. Now, why did they pay? Because it took a long time for the New York Times to explain to them the benefits of paying. And in a world of disinformation that we live in, it's easier to explain to people that if you want quality, then you have to pay up. And what is it that you're paying? I mean, let's face it, we're all willing to pay, I don't know what it is in dirhams, but $4 or $5 for a cup of coffee every morning. I think feeding yourself information is probably even more important than feeding yourself with caffeine or food. So
Yeah.
$2 against the price of $5 for a coffee
Yeah.
is not a big ask, really. It's just that what you said before, if all publishers together understood that this is the way forward and they had avoided dragging this free bonanza of the internet as long as they did, we would have been in a much better place. I think we kind of, media shot itself in the foot by relying too much on the media, on the free internet model, chasing volume as opposed to chasing quality.
Very true, very true. Yes, correct. And there's a lot of content on the print, on the digital side, conferences as well, and but without strategy, content is just stuff. And as they say, the world is enough. So what do the editorial chiefs really have to look at, really, to be able to have a strategic vision to create content? Let's say have a roadmap for the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years, when we should be positioned, when that particular company or that firm should be positioned to be perceived as, let's say, a voice in a particular genre or a particular region. What would it take?
What would it take? I think it would take a lot of research to identify what the customer really wants. Again, I'm sorry, I'm always going back to the New York Times because that's where I've spent most of my time. But we realized that cooking, for example, and food was very important to our customers, and they were willing to pay for it. And yes, the majority of our growth has come from general interest news. It was also a period in the United States where people really genuinely wanted credible news to rely on in the age of Trump. That certainly also helped, but it wasn't the only thing. Like, developing a cooking app or developing a crossword app, and finding out what the interests of your customer base is and giving that to them. So research, I think, plays a very important part. And I don't know if our R&D budgets or our marketing budgets in the media industry are as big as they should be. Here we are, in the communications industry, and our own communications budgets or marketing budgets sometimes leave much to be desired.
Very true. Right. So, so do you feel that there is a strong case to have big data in terms of the editorial room? Is there a need to have data scientists, data lakes, data convergence for us to drive us through?
Yes, absolutely. Data and the capability of data analytics, absolutely. And, I mean, it's no longer just having journalists in your newsroom. I mean, you need to have technicians, you need to have data analysts, you need to have internet experts. It's not just journalists. The producers and the technicians are as important these days.
Right. Great. So probably going back to your love now, though, the Democracy and Culture Foundation, along with the Art for Tomorrow. And it's a very interesting framework, really, where you have taken up a forum that existed for a while, and then you were able to embark on it or create a foundation of its own, and a foundation that has really been very, very relevant and apt for different stakeholders. What has been very significant is that it is a convergence platform for different stakeholders, from people who make the policies, the people on the ground, the business investors, activisms, and so on and so forth, all for a good cause.
This is our world. War, disease, fires, oppression.
An unprecedented pace of technological advancement, and our democratic systems are struggling to keep up.
the asymmetry between how quickly incendiary information and disinformation spreads and how slowly factual information spreads.
This is a world we're inheriting, but it's not the world we want to live in.
What is often overlooked is the social dimension of the urban environment, or in other words, what is called the soft politics. We need to address the needs of the most vulnerable sections within cities.
We understand at this stage in our social and economic evolution that our institutions aren't working very well, and that instability that we're feeling in those institutions are somewhat caused by technology, but technology is also the opportunity space for us to reinvent something new.
بچه‌ای که از یونان بودن همراه از حرف زدم تا بتونم زبان زودتر یاد بگیرم تا بتونم که مردم زیاد در ارتباط باشم و در جامعه داخل شوم.
We should get ready to adapt and build more resilient societies and economies. We should build better bridges of communication between science, politics, and society.
Through Teens for Democracy, we will be able to not only vote for the members of the Student Council, but also for things we really care about, things that affect us and our world. A platform to make our voices heard, affect change, and create pressure local governments and international bodies to acknowledge our seat at the table.
We are launching a climate change hub for Southeastern Europe based in Athens.
To catalyze action at all levels with a special focus on municipalities and local communities.
For a seamless process where a refugee or migrant unaccompanied child youth would be taken care of, educated, encouraged, advised, and offered opportunities.
Only this broad quality supportive network can create real opportunities, not only for the children themselves, but for us Greeks as well.
Digitalization of public services, the infrastructure, the G-Cloud, the data, and of course, it's never just about technology. We need to focus on people.
For democracy to evolve and get out of the glut that it currently is, we need fresh ideas, free of institutional thinking, so that we can broaden the public discourse. In other words, democracy.
So how did this really germinate? How did this consummate in terms of the foundation that it is now?
In terms of?
In terms of the foundation and its strength as of now.
I mean, this shift from media to foundation, and the basis of it is democracy. I've always said that media is the hyphen between that composite word, democracy. I mean, democracy is a composite word. It's the people and it's power.
Correct.
So you don't see it in the word democracy, but right in the middle is where there's the little hyphen bringing the two
wonderful
sets together. And media would be argued is that silent hyphen, because it's what keeps those who govern accountable, at the same time keeps those who are governed, the citizens, informed. And you do need to have an informed citizenship and an engaged citizenship and an interested citizen in order to have good governance. Now, there are very many different models around the world. I mean, democracy is not the be-all and end-all for everyone. There are different cultural values in different parts of the world. In most Western countries, yes, they have chosen this path, but you know, you could argue that the word democracy is interpreted in a different way, even in China, where people feel that it's definitely not democratic. The word democracy in Chinese means a little bit different to what the word democracy in ancient Greece or America means. But the purpose of the foundation is to actually take what we were doing as a media a step further, because, you know, what is conferences? Conferences is all about talking, okay? And probably thinking. When you put the program together, you think what the topics should be, and then you go on stage and you talk, and you talk, and you talk, and you talk. And what happens afterwards? Most of it, in most conferences, tends to disappear in the ether. So that's the realization that we had at my department, the conference department, that we needed to add the do part, and we created an impact chain: think, talk, do. There's no point having a conference and not doing something about it. So the reason why we created a foundation is because foundations as non-profit institutions have more flexibility to get involved in advocacy and activism. And when you're dealing with things like democracy, for example, it's inadvertently you will go down the path of advocacy. And that's what we believe in, and that's what we want to promote. But doing that as a media company would have compromised us a little bit, because as a media company, at least that's the philosophy of the New York Times, you have to have an independent stance, and you should not get in the world of advocacy and activism. It's not there to push beliefs. It's there just to inform people. The foundation is there to take what is said at the stage of the conference and turn it into some kind of action. So that's why we felt that there was a need to, take the democracy conference out, and then we felt that the Art for Tomorrow conference, which is all about the arts and culture, was another suitable one to take and put under the same foundation, because many of us believe that democracy is culture. But most of us believe that culture and the arts is a catalyst in social development and also citizen engagement. It's much easier to galvanize and excite people through the arts and culture, truth be known, through that, rather than through politics and democracy. A lot of people have lost faith in politics and democracy. So we felt that by forming a foundation that was interested in both the cultural aspect and the governance aspect, we would be a little bit more effective in trying to turn some of the things we hear on stage into policy recommendations, into initiatives, into actions that help a society and help people.
Wonderful, wonderful. And probably for the foundation, there are probably two very strong pillars, right? Empowering the citizenry, and then also looking at better governance. And in doing so, rather, I think it's very admirable that you're able to take Art for Tomorrow from a collectible form of vocation, rather, to probably being a catalyst for change. That's fantastic. And probably one more takeaway that I had, probably as I've been following your foundation for a while as well, has been the demystification of the word democracy by itself, where you argue that it's not a static concept where it can be threatened or has to be defended, but it's a very gradual, adaptive kind of a process where it will probably evolve over time. So how has that been in terms of a call for action? Has it been any kind of action on the ground beyond the thinking and the dialogue that happens in the forum?
Yes, look, I think people understand this, that democracy is not really there just to be defended. Democracy is something that evolves. When we say, and some people at the beginning said to me, oh my God, but you can't change democracy. And I'm like, well, yes, you can. What you cannot change is the value system upon which democracy is based on, the rule of law, human rights, freedoms, that's sacronast. But democracy is a form of governance, really. And it has to adapt. It has to change because our world is changing. I mean, AI and robotics and the biotech revolution is going to produce a very different society in 50 years from now to what we had 50 years ago. So you can't expect that the democracy of 50 years ago is going to work 50 years down the track. So one thing that we're doing now is we've identified some functional blocks of democracy, some functional building blocks of democracy.
Right.
We've identified 5 of them. The power of the people, which is all about how important citizen assemblies are becoming, the power of the executive, which is something that we need to check whether the members of parliament or prime ministers have too much power, and that needs to be balanced by the judiciary and others. The power of information, which is all about AI and information and the internet, how that is needs to be taken into consideration. The power of voting, whether, you know, we see teenagers becoming much more involved and engaged in social issues, especially in climate, but also other issues. So should we lower the voting age? Should we go for mandatory voting? And finally, the power of influence, as we call it, or the power of money. And we see the bad effect that money has on, that business has on lobbying governments. And we have forgotten the good part of lobbying. So again, we need to find a balance there of how much influence, how much money needs to enter political parties, how much political parties need to reform. So we will take those 5 building blocks to different cities around the world. It's Sydney, Seoul, Berlin, and a few other cities. And we will convene experts to tell us what it is that needs to change in making citizen assemblies more effective, for example. But then we will get those experts, they will make their policy recommendations and suggestions, but we're going to stress test what they say through citizens panels, so we can have a more grassroots and more bottom-up, because that's what people have lost trust in the experts that always impose their opinion top-down. Whereas the word democracy by itself means that it's a bottom-up approach.
Absolutely.
We've lost that art of consensus, that art of collaborating between the citizens and the people that govern. And we will present the outcomes of this in September when we do our 10th Athens Democracy Forum.
Wonderful.
Another thing that we're doing is we're creating a platform for teenagers. We're calling it Teens for Democracy. And that's a mechanism that we want to put in place in order to create intergenerational dialogue, so that older generations not only listen to teens, but take some of their ideas and put them into legislation or actions. It's a slow process. I mean, we've only been a foundation for more than a year and a half or so.
Yes.
But I think this year we're going to start seeing, having a few runs on the board and seeing a few new platforms being proposed and working with the EU and the government in Greece in starting to create new legislation, new initiatives, and everything we work on is replicable and scalable. So it's going to be able to be exported to other parts of the world as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And probably I think what is most redeeming is that you will not prescribe or proscribe, but you'll subscribe to a way of thinking that will galvanize collective action and probably change the way we look at democracy by itself.
Yes, collective action, collective thinking, that's what really, and citizen engagement, that's what's going to produce better governance. Now, whether that better governance is called democracy or it's called something else in different parts of the world. Yes.
True. And probably one more very interesting take that probably comes out of the foundation and the forum is that you equate the COVID-19 pandemic with democracy. And you say COVID-19 is just one of the pandemics that has probably been thorn in the flesh really for the democracy movement, which is your inequality, your racism, populism, and so on and so forth. So how are these aspects also being, let's say, highlighted or catered to or dealt with in the manner that it's meant to be?
Yes, it's interesting that you raised this because we realized last year that the world is not just suffering from one pandemic. All these pandemics have been with us. And what does pandemic mean? Again, the true definition of the word, which is a composite word, pandemos, that all people are affected. All people are affected by the climate crisis. All people are affected by inequality. All people are affected by racism. And what COVID managed to do is to bring this great acceleration, and it kind of uncovered a lot. And people started realizing that, you know, maybe the core of our problem as our society is not just COVID. I mean, COVID is something that there's vaccinations, it's going to run its course, and we're going to find a solution to it. It's much harder. I mean, you can't vaccinate a society so that it can become an equal society, and you can't vaccinate the planet so that we get rid of the climate crisis. You need people and the governing powers to come together and do something about it. I think we should be grateful in a way, and I say this with a grain of salt, obviously, because a lot of us have suffered through the pandemic. But in a way, if we look beyond the suffering, we should be grateful that something like this came to us to awaken that if we had continued to go down the path we were going, you know, the normal, as we said, maybe we were doomed. And now we do have a hope of learning from this very painful lesson of COVID in order to fix the other pandemics that have become even more prominent.
Very true. And probably from moving slightly away from your public-private partnership earlier to probably what your forum is trying to do is to bring the PPS, right? Society also becomes a part of that partnership. So public-private society partnerships is getting traction, and that will be fantastic.
Yes, so it's private, public, and civil society.
Right.
And the foundation falls in the civil society category, but it is all three of them that need to come together, not just two.
Very true, very true. And one more very important layer, though, that came about and very strongly, and people also felt very strongly about it, and that is the disinformation black hole, as they say. And there are very interesting thoughts about it, how we are able to kind of find a way to kind of regulate social media platforms. Also looking at, let's say, the UN, probably getting their own news agency that is really, worth the salt. So your thoughts on that?
Again, as I mentioned before, one of our building blocks is information, the power of information. And I have a feeling that disinformation is going to be something that features very heavily. Because yes, one of our sponsors, one of our supporters is Facebook. And I know that Facebook has a lot to answer for.
Right.
Facebook knows themselves that they have a lot to answer for. But you know what? It's better for them to be around the table with activists, with politicians, with citizens, with business people, in order to solve this problem that we have created. All of us created this problem of disinformation. I mean, it's not Facebook. Facebook probably, and Google's, and I'm not pointing a finger at Facebook, but big tech has probably accelerated the problem and amplified it. But there is an urgent need for regulation. There is an urgent need for more competition in the tech sector, because it just can't continue like this. And we hope that we'll be able to contribute as other foundations are coming up with remedies of how to deal with this plague of disinformation. But regulation obviously is one big part of it, and the biggest part of it is education. We have to teach our children to be good digital citizens first and foremost, and then everything else, because we are entering a very different phase in our history. We're entering a digital society.
Yeah.
It's not going to be the same as our grandparents experienced, obviously. So the emphasis of education now needs to be teaching children to be good digital citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So education and regulation.
So probably a thought as well on surveillance capitalism. That probably is a huge buzzword now. And probably that's why you need to have digital and media literacy, probably as a part of school, where they're growing up, and also to be included as a part of your adult education. Because I believe some survey was found that the adult populace rather are the prime spreaders of so-called fake news or taking news at so-called face value. So probably there's a lot of sensitization even on that front in terms of how we're going to really nurture them probably at tier 1 and tier 2 as we kind of very rightly move along to the new age in our history. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the education curricula around the world are an anachronism. It's one of the last bastions that, I mean, at the beginning of our podcast, I was saying how media shot themselves in the foot by not waking up to the internet revolution a little bit quicker than what they did. Well, the education sector and curriculums have been far worse.
Mm-hmm.
So that needs to change. But also you mentioned another very interesting word in your commentary just now, that of capitalism.
Surveillance capitalism
is in transition.
Yeah.
A lot of what we're going through has to do with the fact that capitalism has become an anachronism in the way we do it. We moved from industrial capitalism to casino capitalism, as I call it, starting from the late 70s, 80s, and 90s. We're paying the price of unfettered deregulation and liberalization of markets in the 80s and 90s. We're paying the price now. But, human beings are resilient. They know that in a way, they've been taken on a ride by casino capitalism, and now we're slowly starting to see the shift towards this new form of capitalism that many people are calling inclusive capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
But, it goes with the narrative that society is changing. As human beings, we've been transitioned from being subject for, thousands of years into being consumers shortly after the Industrial Revolution came along.
Yeah.
And now we're transitioning finally to citizens. So this transition from subjects to consumers to citizens is very important. And that's why I said at the very beginning of our podcast that I'm really happy that I'm leaving now as opposed to when our friend Mark used to live in.
Different times.
Because this is an exciting phase and we've got to get it right so that the future generations prosper.
Very true. And probably if I could get a slightly different context, really, you spoke about different age that we are at, different times, different mankind itself facing problems and issues and bottlenecks that was not perceived or conceived earlier. Now you had in your forum really a very best-selling author called Yuval Noah Harari, the best-selling author for *Sapiens: History of Mankind*. So I wasn't able to follow him though, but I would be very kind of keen to know what exactly were his thoughts in terms of what's happening around the world now, with in hindsight looking at the evolution of mankind.
One of the biggest lessons that I've had from Yuval Noah Harari, listening to him and also reading *Sapiens* and Amadeus and his latest book, 21 Lessons, is that, again, it's a transitionary thing. There's been instances in history where science and technology was much more powerful, and other instances in history, other phases in history where the humanities, religion.
Yeah.
And, during those times where religion was on a high, we kind of tapped science down, and people lived in blind faith. Well, blind faith is not going to get us anywhere. And what we're seeing is an era now where humanities and science need to coexist in a much more symbiotic way. They need to, so what Yuval said is that science needs ethics, more ethics.
Yeah.
And that's what these big technology companies need to do, is to come closer to the humanities and become more ethical and find out what the new ethics of technology will look like. But on the other hand, humanities too need to become a little bit more aware of technology and science. So again, it's getting the balance right between these two. And it's quite telling how the last chapter of Yuval Noah Harari's book was dedicated on meditation. And, you know, some people come to me and ironically said that, oh yes, if you meditate, all our world's problems will disappear, which is a silly thing to say. But it is true that if we look into ourselves more, and if we make ourselves happy and sustainable, which is the thing behind meditation, then probably our world will be a much better place to live in.
True, and probably I think it goes back to one of the ills. It is more in terms of your mental well-being, mental resilience.
Exactly.
And that is where yoga, meditation, all that really helps to put you in the right frame of mind where you're able to face the world in a much better manner. Well, you know, in hindsight, they say hindsight is a beautiful word, you know, but the present keeps us going, the past keeps us anchored, and future dictates where you ought to go. Now, if you had to look back in your journey so far, your checkered journey so far, is there anything that you'd like to change, though, in hindsight?
If I look back at my journey.
At your journey, yes.
No, I think I'm still very much in the middle of the
probably few things, few moves that you've made, or probably a few calls that you have probably taken in the past, or few initiatives or kind of, you know, things that you've done. Probably as you look back, would have done it in a slightly different manner, or you would not have done it at all, or probably would have done something else.
I think I'd like to, I probably would have been a little bit more intuitive, trusted my gut a little bit more than what I did. At the beginning of my career, I was very caught up in all those management consultancy books of, you know, business planning, strategizing, and all the rest of it. And yes,
do they really help, Achilles? Do they really help? Do they really help? All the self-help books, or the motivational books?
They do help, but I'm talking more about the management consultant books, which is all about business planning. I think what is lacking there is more self-help on our human side, and more reliance on our hearts and less reliance on our brains.
Yeah, that's a big statement. Fair enough. So, you know, is there any character, let's say in a movie or a book, or probably that, you know, closely resonates with who you are really, you know, something that is very close to you?
Oh boy, well, with a name like Achilles.
I was about to get onto that, but I'll get that later.
I have to go back to my roots and say Achilles. My mother always used to tell me one thing, that she said, oh, you know, if I was to name you again, I would probably name you Ulysses rather than Achilles. Because Ulysses taught us to go with our intuition a little bit more than our strength.
Right.
So I would say these two, and I would say I always am inspired by Socrates, who said that I'm not a citizen of Athens or Greece, but of the world.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
And you know, probably because you brought up Socrates, I think in probably one of the modules of your forum, there was one particular dialogue where he said, is it Confucius or is Socrates who is more relevant as a philosopher? So I'm not too sure what was the conclusion.
Yes, we did the Confucius-Socrates dialogue.
Yeah.
And we brought two experts, one on Confucius, one on Socrates. Socrates was a woman, which is great in these times that we live in. We need to think of that as well, of gender equality. But what was really interesting and why we did this Confucius and Socrates dialogue, because I think if somehow we were able to bring those two back to life and get them in the same room, they would find solutions to the problems of globalization much more effectively than what President Xi and President Biden can solve. So that's the philosophy behind bringing these two very wise people from ancient times who had quite different cultural upbringings together to talk about today's problems and find common ground, find that third way.
Yeah. So probably they'll be able to help, give us a context wherein you move away from lip service to actual service, actionable service on the ground. That is really for the larger good.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Fair enough. Achilles, has been a fantastic chat. What next? Probably, you have really traversed really forums, different genres, different vocations and passions. What is the next that is probably up your sleeve?
The establishment of a global center for democratic dialogue, something like an institute. That's a big task, but I think that is the ultimate goal of this foundation, to create an institute that helps the world and democracy evolve.
Fantastic. 3 cheers to that, Achilles. I wish you and your team, your fantastic team, really all the best in terms of creating the new that we should ideally be looking at, the new abnormal or the new normal, so we subscribe to, and let the world be a much better place. I would say the world is a much better place for people like you as well, because we are able to transform and change the way that really we ought to think. It's been fantastic having you here. Achilles, always a pleasure. I wish you all the very best. Keep inspiring and keep shining, sir.
Thank you very much, Roy. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you so much. You take care. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
If you've liked this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified for future episodes.